Okay, continuing the lecture. I'm sorry I had the audio failure. I believe I was on this slide, which is the Nieuwkerk in Amsterdam. So let's continue on. This is 1408. It's a one of the first examples, the first example that the book uses of the architecture of the Protestant Reformation post Luther posting his 95 Theses. It characteristically should look already like a Gothic church to you because it is a Gothic church, and it's an example of Protestant architecture because they occupy the church and remake the church for their purposes. The few character defining features that we want to talk about on this slide is something you're probably seeing already, which is the whitewashing or the absence of color, or at least the absence of a high incidence of use of color. There's formal variation. We see the fluting on the column. We see the bevel detail here in the archways. So there's a lot of resemblance formally and even materially to classical architecture, to Gothic architecture. Well, because it is Gothic architecture. But what makes it divergent is the notion of whitewashing, which we talked about in the beginning of the lecture. So this is part of the ideals of taking the focus off of the building, off of the architecture, and allowing the focus to be the congregants and the function taking place on the inside. The second thing that I'll point out, and I'll toggle back and forth to a plan to emphasize this point. But first, let me point it out here before we go to a two-dimensional plan view. You were looking down the nave, the axis of this painting, of this image, is down the long axis of the nave, and you know by now we're looking at, on the left hand side, a side aisle, and in the background we're seeing on the right hand side secondary, so symmetrical, single side aisle, typical church plan or an old basilican plan that's been remade as a Gothic church that in the 15th century is being remade into a Protestant church. Those bits of parts are familiar to you from prior architectural studies. What is important, the second important point that makes this a good example of Protestant Reform architecture, is that the primary axes of both the painting and the way the people are depicted in the painting is our angle of position, and our angle of focus is not the rear apse or the altar that would be at the terminus of this long nave. Rather, this element that you're seeing here, which is a pulpit, which is where the preacher would be preaching from, is actually positioned such that the congregants would be arranged in a wide orientation along the nave, with their perspective perpendicular to the long axes rather than along the long axes. Let me go to the plan to articulate that point, hopefully a little bit more carefully. So that's Oosterkerk. We're going to look at in a minute. This is Nieuwkerk that we are looking at in the slide. And imagine that the pulpit is positioned, so it's a nave plan church, rear apse on this side. And imagine that pulpit in the image, in the painting that's being depicted, is over here on the right-hand side, and the orientation is this way. And the congregants are seated in a wide spread this way, focusing, or with their perspective, on the pulpit, which is across the short axes. This would be the short axes versus the long axes. So kind of flipping the idea of how they use space on its head. So there's the whitewashing, there's the change of orientation in terms of the position within the building. And then this is still an interior image. We're going to look at, when we get to Oosterkerk here in a minute, we're going to see the exterior expression and the simplification manifest itself even on the outside of the building and in the form of the architecture itself. I think before my audio cut out, I didn't make this point, I had not made this point before the audio cut out, which is that we're looking at a painting, and we're looking at a painting of Nieuwkerk, and Nieuwkerk does not exist anymore. And that's why we don't have a photograph of it, and we're relying on a painting. But the book makes the point that Dutch painters of this time took great pride in depicting the churches of the Protestant Reformation. So this is a painting by Pieter Jan Saenredam, Saenredam. You don't need to memorize the painter. And another prominent painter, a Dutch painter that was known for his painting, and actually we're going to look at one of his paintings on the next slide, was known to depict the architecture of the Protestant Reformation, is Emmanuel de Witte, Wiite. So here's another example. This is a really good example of the notion of whitewashing, basically making white or not adding color to the interior material, and let marble be marble, or let concrete or brick be clad in a white plaster to give the effect of something being pure and void of ornament, void of color variation, so that the focus can be taken off of the matter, the built work, the form, the space, and really the focus of attention can be the person delivering the message, or the whatever, the spiritual activity taking place inside. But that notion of non-central focus is going to be very important, and it's going to come up most prominently in the next lecture when we get into the Baroque period of architecture, because it's going to now become actually what's starting with the Protestant Reformation is going to make its way back into the architecture of Catholicism, where the Pope, the papacy, is actually going to give an edict or demand that their architects don't make a central planned church. And so part of the credit for that goes to the innovation that the architects of the Protestant Reformation brought about. Okay, so second slide, and this is a third painting of a very similar space. Characteristically, again, in terms of the envelope and the structure, not necessarily very different. You will, and you saw even in the slides here, that could be a Roman basilica, that could be a Renaissance church, that could be a Gothic cathedral. So it's not formally, it's not necessarily different from what we've seen in the past, and neither is this painting. We're looking at a side aisle, we're looking at columns, we're even looking at coffering. So there is a lot of the same architectural spatial gestures. It's just really it's the surface quality and the aesthetics, the interior appearance, the interior aesthetic appearance of the space is where the whitewashing comes in, and the purification, I would describe it as, of the interior. Okay, this is Oosterkerk, also in Amsterdam, 1669 through 1671. This is architect Daniel Stalpaert, Stalpaert. And I actually want to start with a plan of this one. This is the church we're looking at here. This is Daniel Stalpaert's Oosterkerk, late 17th century. It starts with the Greek cross. Starts with the Orthodox Greek cross plan. You see it here: nave, transept, crossing. There's the traditional Greek plan church. The difference is what Stalpaert does by, I would say, simplifying that form. So taking the Greek cross plan, which has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 corners. 1, 2, 3, 4 of which are interior corners, the rest of which are exterior corners. What did I count? 12. So 8 exterior corners, 4 interior corners. That's 12 corners total. What he does is he simplifies that by basically filling in those corner spaces and making the Greek cross plan really a simple square, which now has, as we all know, really only 4 corners: 1, 2, 3, 4. So he's simplifying the form. He's taking the ordinary plan that we've been building for 1,000 years already at this time, and he's simplifying it by actually adding to it, not necessarily by subtracting from it. So that's a very interesting and innovative contribution that Stalpaert makes as part of the architectural values that the Protestant Reformation brings. So that's one. The other that we see, and we just got done looking at some of the work of the Ottoman Empire, and a lot, and I graded all of the essays. Great work on the essays as well. A few of you talked about the notion. I don't remember if it was a term that I used in lecture or you guys have come up with this vocabulary term on your own, but you talked about the cascading effect of the building stepping down, 7 or 8 levels, starting from the main semi-dome and then working its way down to like the minarets and the outer perimeter of the church. Well, we've retained that notion of stepping down, right? This is the Greek cross volume that's extruded up, or that is expressed at the upper level. I would say probably at the 4th story and above. Primary level is here. So I would say single story, 2nd story, maybe the 3rd story here. And so at the 4th level or 4th story, or really the 3rd story of the building, the 3rd floor, I should say, of the building, is where is the Greek cross plan is extruded up to that level, but the corners are filled in to a lower level. So there is that cascading effect, but it's not 8 levels deep, or multiple levels, really beyond just 2, maybe 3 if you count the steeple or the bell tower. The other important thing I think to point out here is that there are some Romanesque characteristics in the use of the brick, but it is also void of heavy ornamentation. Let's focus for a moment just on this arched window here. So square window at the piano nobile at the ground level, and taller linear arch window that aligns with the bay above it. The detail work of the head arch above the window, you can see, is actually not in relief, nor is it built out. So it's not expressed. It's in the same plane as the masonry facade. So its functional purpose is resolved by creating a vossuer and an archway to take the loads, to distribute the loads evenly down onto the jambs of the window, distribute the load to the rest of the brick. But it hasn't gone any further than that. There's no articulation. There's no added cornices. There's no detail work. There's no Rococo appliques applied to the top of the arch of the window. It is serving its functional purpose, and it ends there. There's no detail. The only detail I would say really about this window opening is the sill with the brick. We call that a soldier course. It's basically the same brick that you're seeing in the facade, rotated 90 degrees and turned towards you to create that deep sill effect. That's really the only articulation of this opening. The window has some detailing, but that's not anything different from what we've seen in the past. And really, that's a function of how large pieces of glass the limitation in how we were able to manufacture glass at this time. The Industrial Revolution hasn't happened yet, so the notion of plate glass or large pieces of float glass has not been invented yet. So really, the steel sash window that you're looking at here is limited. It has a lot of grid spacing because we don't have the luxury of having 4, 5, 6, 10, 20 foot long pieces of glass yet in our building material. Okay, this is a view of the outside. The slide we are going to look at next is actually the same, the opposite mirror perspective, or the perspective of that same corner, except just from the inside. So where the notion of whitewashing was evident in an abstract way from the painting, you're now seeing an actual slide or a picture of what that looks like in a church that exists today. That idea of the nave and the pulpit being positioned off to the side rather than along that long axis is very evident here in this pulpit. I believe this is called a soundboard. And really, that's just to help amplify the sound of the speaker who's speaking from the pulpit, or to actually throw that sound deeper into the space. And that's a common thing that you'll see in a lot of these slides. I think this is actually one of my favorite slides from this entire lecture series on the Protestant Reformation. And it lends itself to the flexibility of space when it isn't so opulent, when it isn't so ornamented. And really, what I'm thinking of when I say that, I'm thinking of St. Peter's Basilica. A highly articulated space with lots going on, sculptures, art, decorative archways, Corinthian columns, mosaics on the dome ceiling, just lots happening. Very easy to be distracted and have the architecture be the thing that's really capturing your attention rather than the event taking place within it. Obviously, in the Protestant Reformation, the point's been driven home now that they're trying to basically counteract that and be excessive in the opposite direction of the simplification and stripping down of the architectural space of all of that effort, I would say. But what this slide speaks to most is the flexibility that lends itself when you approach architectural design in that manner. And here's specifically what I mean. If I took St. Peter's Basilica and I placed desks just like this slide shows and oriented those desks to convey that this is let's say, a college exam taking place in this space, which is a church, college exam taking place with desks oriented actually the opposite direction, not towards the pulpit, the opposite direction towards the door, which would really, we know to read that as kind of backwards right now. It doesn't actually look out of place. I would not feel uncomfortable taking an exam in this space. I wouldn't feel like I'm out of place. Now, if you did the same exercise in St. Peter's Basilica and you position desks in the same manner in the nave facing the back door, I would feel it's a little bit awkward. The space doesn't fit the function. So I think this slide is a really strong image that conveys the flexibility that the simplification of space allows. The plan here. So this is the book here is talking about the other examples of innovation that the Dutch, German, Scandinavian architects are attempting to introduce or are introducing and testing architecturally in the Protestant Reformation. Number 4 is actually an auditorium format church, and that's by Adrian Dortzman, another prominent Dutch Protestant Reform architect. And number 4 is actually the second variation I think I talked about in the lecture opening, that really the book puts it all together under the broad title Protestant Reformation, but there's really kind of 2 branches of a reaction, of a backlash against the architecture of the papacy, of the Catholic Church. And one is what the Dutch are doing, but the other wing is really what's happening in England with the Anglicans and the British and the English and even the Irish and the Scots to some degree. And one name, which is a very, very prominent name, not just in this time period, but really in all of architectural history, is a British architect, English architect by the name of Sir Christopher Wren. So number 5 is actually a plan which is going to get us into some of the work of Sir Christopher Wren. So remember that name, Christopher, spelled traditionally. Last name is Wren, W-R-E-N, Christopher Wren. Okay, the book makes the point also about, this is kind of getting away from the religious architecture, talks about the notion of egalitarianism that's present in Dutch culture. This is a canal in Amsterdam, and the democratic process and society insisted that, despite the fact that the merchant, for example, that lived in this building, this narrow, tall building immediately on the canal with its facade facing the canal, while this man may have been, or this family may have been very wealthy, multimillionaire merchants, they insisted on approaching the plots of land along the canal and really throughout the core of the city in an even way. There should be the folks who were from the aristocracy or the more wealthy class should really have no plot of land any larger than the common folks or the average, the middle class, if you will. The one variation is that they may have two plots of land versus one plot of land. But this idea that really the book's main point is that they're not opulent, they're not boastful about their wealth, and that has implications on architecture in that we see a lot of simplification in the work. The other interesting thing that it talks about, and I don't have a good section to show you, but this image of the parapet may help convey the idea of, I would say, dynamism in their facade design. It's hard to read in this slide, but really all of the buildings that are positioned on the canal here, the reason they're positioned on the canal is because they were, let's say, industrial buildings on the ground floor and domicile above. Where the industrial portion of the building is where they would basically use these armatures, that sort of clasp system, to hang a chain or a pulley system from, pull something off of the back of a docked ship that has stopped in the canal, lift that cargo up, swing it around, and basically store it in the building where the merchant needs that supply. What that led to over time, really starting in the 16th and 17th centuries, is the architects starting to realize that when they if we start to tilt the facades inward a little bit, it actually helps functionally, so that just when the chain hangs plumb with a weight at the bottom of it, it doesn't actually slam up against the facade and cause damage to the building, but also gives the folks pulling the cargo off of the ship, room to work. And that's become kind of a thing in Dutch architecture even today. When facades and parapets are built, even if it's not necessarily on the edge of a canal, you'll see this architectural element, which is really a homage to that time period. And then a study showing how really that had an impact on facade design in such a way that really we were always looking at pyramidal forms, because the tallest point always needed to be in the middle. And so this is showing, 4 or 5 different variations that architects have come up with of solving that problem. There's probably some resemblance here to what we studied in the work of Alberti when he was trying to resolve how to basically take the Gothic church and apply a classical or a Renaissance facade to it. And you guys remember the studies of where he would take the pediment, he would kind of split the pediment off to one side, he would push it towards the back. So there's a lot of that kind of experimentation that we're seeing the architects take on here. Okay. This is the name of this building is Stadhuis, Stadhuis. It's the Royal Palace in Amsterdam, built 1648 to 1668. This, if you walked in the first day of class and I showed you this slide, I doubt very much you would say this looks simple or this looks stripped down. And I understand that. But you've been looking at, to date, 400 or 500 years of really the buildup of detail and ornamentation in the Renaissance, and we're going to get into the Baroque here in the next week. And detail will come back and actually come back with a vengeance. But up until now, you're seeing the buildup of that high level of detail, the high buildup, high sculptural quality. And this is a response to really the book actually says literally, this building is a response to the excess of Versailles, which is the palace in France, the Versailles Palace we know well. The architect is Jacob van Campen, Jacob van Van, Campen, Campn, 1595 to 1657. And like I mentioned, it may not look on its surface as though it's a good example of simplified architecture, but let's break it down. First and foremost, I don't see the front entrance. The reason I don't see the front entrance is because it doesn't have an entrance on this axis, which is clearly the primary facade of the building. What they've done is they've oriented the primary facade towards this courtyard and have this nice kind of open outdoor public space in front of it. Also allows the building to be set back and gives it kind of this sort of formal distance away from some of the other buildings in the street line to the left and to the right. But by not positioning the entrance on this primary facade, it's a rectangular plan, and so you're looking at the long axes. What it's doing is it's putting the front entrance. It's over to the left. I know it happens to be over to the left. It's on the short axis, so it's hidden from view of this public courtyard, but it's also on the less prominent of the two axes of the plan. So that's one. The plinth is, if you look at the base detailing of the plinth or the lower level, you will see. And if you just compare it, compare it to Brunelleschi's work, compare it to Alberti's work, compare it to any of the work that we looked at in early and humanist Italy. And look at the base. We talked about the rustification and the exploration of different kind of stone patterns. And you guys will remember the idea in Brunelleschi's work of modulating the size of the stone from the base up to the top. So there's a lot of effort being put into trying to invent new ways to treat the facade at the base. You don't see that here. It's basically clean cut blocks of stone that actually look like they're in the same plane even as the facade. They're not even pulled out from that plane. The windows, it's kind of hard to tell from this slide. A, it's at a distance, and second, it's not the highest quality. Here's a better slide. The windows you can see are actually quite simple. I would even describe them as maybe being elegantly simple, but not a lot of detail that we're seeing here. And I would say the third thing, okay, so the tympanum in the pediment, I think looks just like what it looks like in the Renaissance. So there's really no differentiation between with what we're seeing here. And I would say the dome, and I'm not sure, somebody can fact check this and let me know, and I'll give extra credit if somebody looks this up. My guess is at the Royal Palace at Stadhuis, this is not in the same time period. Either that dome has been rebuilt or that dome was built at a later time and it was not completed at the same time. That's my guess. I could be wrong on that, but I would say that this doesn't look characteristically different from the work that we've seen so far. Neither does the placement of the sculptures. It's really down here that we're seeing something new, which, as I mentioned, is a response to the opulence of Louis XIV, of the palace at Versailles, and the stuff happening in the St. Peter's Church and in the Roman Catholic Church. Oh, and the third important thing to point out here is, so there are pilasters, there are express pilasters, but you can see from this slide that the pilaster relief is very, very subtle. I can't tell from this distance what that dimension is, but I would guess it's less than a foot. It's probably inches, maybe something closer to like 4 or 5 inches of relief that's really creating the effect of this pilaster in relation to the facade adjacent. So very, very subtle. Even the capital detailing, it's almost like the architect has taken caution to, in our traditional orders, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, column capital, what you'll see if you look back at any of those details is at the capital, there's a flaring out that's probably at least a fourth of the width, the diameter of the column itself. There's a projection outward of about a fourth of that dimension on either side. So there's basically this wing motif at the capital. You don't see that. It looks as though actually the architect is taking great care to kind of confine the same detailing of the what looks like probably a Corinth, maybe an Ionic order, perhaps Corinthian, there he's trying to keep the boundary of that in the same plane as the diameter of the column. That's a clear gestural effort towards simplification. I have to confess, I'm not sure what the book means by this, but it talks about this the architecture having Baroque proportions. Um, Plinth high and low windows. The plinth we talked about, the tympanum, and the discrete entry. Okay, we talked about that. This is the interior of the space. This space has a name, and apparently it's called Burgersaal Hall, which is, and maybe this is what is meant by the proportion, because it does specifically state that the proportions of this space or the dimensions of this space are 40 by 20, 40 along the axis we're looking at, 20 along this axis. So there's this kind of ordering and 2-to-1 proportional nature to the space. I don't know. I really like the quality of the space. I don't know if it's the marble or the white. Maybe it's the symmetry. I'm a fan of asymmetry as well. I'm not. It's not necessarily that I'm drawn to it because of the symmetrical effect, but there's something about this space and the way the light fills this space. The symmetry seems to work really, really nicely with it. It's a beautiful, beautiful space. Okay, back to Sir Christopher Wren. Definitely his magnum opus is St. Paul's Cathedral. St. Paul's Cathedral plan, as you're seeing here, built from 1680 to 1710. This is the entrance to St. Paul's Cathedral. Lots of detail, lots of ornamentation, for sure. Can't say that it's looks the same as some of the Dutch work that we were looking at in the Protestant Reformation. But the one similarity is that it does have the whitewashing effect. There's this idea and this fascination with not using color architecturally any longer. Wren is doing it. A lot of the work that we're looking at in this time period has the same quality, and certainly we saw the work of the Dutch and the Germans in the Protestant Reformation. So that's I would say the one common thread is the absence of color. The thing I always like to point out about St. Paul's Cathedral, and this is not something from the book, this is sort of my own conjecture that I've come to the conclusion of, which is that there's a striking resemblance to me in the architecture of the Anglicans and specifically of Sir Christopher Wren here at St. Paul's Cathedral and our Capitol building in Washington, D.C. I don't know if it may be immediately obvious to you just looking at this slide. There's sort of 3-layer, tholobate, the radial plan tholobate rising up to this. So really 3 levels or 4 levels if you count the cupola, the steeple here. I think that's similar. Obviously, the notion of the all white. The whitewashing of both facade elements, roof elements, really everything. I think there's a resemblance and a similarity there. Yet we still see the classical elements still rear their head. They're not. We haven't stripped them away completely. We see the pediments above the windows. Certainly, we see the columns at the entry portal. And in terms of organization, we've kept this idea of, ordering bays with second floor, first floor windows kind of in alignment. So there's our Capitol, and there's St. Paul's. I think so. There's a view of the dome, St. Paul's. Close-up view of the dome. Okay, another work of Sir Christopher Wren is this small, simple building, which is in, I think it's Greenwich, but it's spelled Greenwich. This is the Queen's House. This is 1616, so early 17th century. Sorry, not Christopher Wren. This is Inigo Jones, another with Sir Christopher Wren, the sort of two most important names you need to know from 17th century England. So Inigo Jones does this, and it's an homage to the Palladian villas. We didn't study Palladio; that's in a prior class that is before the time frame of this class. But Palladio is another luminary architect who was known to really have done a deep study and spent his entire career dealing with the architectural design of the villa, which is both the town home for the rich, but also the country home for the rich. The notion of the basically the small private house. So it's a play on the Palladian villa, or an homage to the Palladian villa, but it's a very simple form, flat roof, which is really one of the first times that idea is being tested out, especially for a domicile. And one of my favorite things about this space is this interior element, which is called the tulip stairs, and it's this sort of circular, winding stairway that is light filled with this glass dome on top, but also the radius is concentrically getting smaller and smaller as you move up to the to I think what is the third level of the building, and the last is this one. So back to Sir Christopher Wren. This is Saint Stephen Walbrook in London, late late 17th century, 1672. Greek cross in plan, which you should be able to read here. 20-meter wide dome. And really, what is going to be the most interesting thing to know about this space is pay attention to the division of the dome into these eight, I guess, pie shaped pieces. And we're going to look at how he's resolved between columns in these eight semi sections of that central dome. So there's a section study. And there's a slide of the interior of that space. So this is kind of the first time. So we've seen lots. We've seen it in we've seen it in the Armenian architecture. We've seen it in the Roman architecture. We've seen it in the Ottoman architecture. We've seen it in the Russian architecture. I suppose even there are some incidents in the work that we looked at of the Ming Dynasty in China. But the idea of taking a square plan or a Greek cross and resolving the groin vault or the squinches, we've seen happen when you're dealing with two orthogonal planes. This is really the first time we're seeing it in a radial plan, in a radial arrangement. And really what that means, I'm sorry I can't sketch on these slides, but really what that means is that we're springing from this column. So we're springing from these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 points, but we're not springing planar to that point. We're springing actually from that point to 2 points that are on a radius from that bottom point. I think the best way is actually just do a simple sketch. So imagine that we're coming up from a point, but that point is rising up to a position vertically in relation to it that is at the same height in relationship, but it's actually sweeping around this circular dome. So he's taking on a new challenge and actually resolving it in I would describe in a magnificent way, while maintaining the idea of the the purity of the absence of color, and I wouldn't say simplification in terms of the detail, because there's a high amount of detail, especially in the coffering of the dome, but something about the lack of color that makes it not feel overbearing, I guess. There's a really, really clear view. So that's kind of the plane from my sketch of just that point springing from here to here, but being resolved around this radius, and then 8 of those arrayed around a central point. Stunning spatial exploration. That's the way the book describes it. I think that's a good way to leave it. And those are really, really good words. Stunning spatial exploration. Okay. That's it. That's it on Protestant Reformation and 16th, 17th century England. We will pick up with the Baroque with the next lecture. So thank you for your attention.